I'm going to give it about another 2 minutes before we begin here, just letting people shuffle in. All right, let's go ahead and get started here. So hello and good evening. My name is Brendan Catt. I'm a 2L at the Oregon Law and a conference co-director for the 39th Annual Public Interest Environmental Law Conference, or PIELC. This evening, we're excited to welcome Vic Barrett to PIELC's guest lecture series. Before we begin, I would like to take this time to acknowledge a few groups and individuals and introduce Vic. First, I would like to acknowledge our Children's Trust, the University of Oregon School of Law's Environmental and Natural Resource Center, and Earth Guardians for promoting and assisting in the organization of this event. Next, I would like to thank my fellow PIELC conference co-directors and the 1L representatives for making this event possible. Finally, I would like to introduce Vic. Vic's passion for climate activism began at a young age after experiencing the devastating effects of climate change firsthand. At 15, he became a fellow with the Alliance for Climate Education and spoke at COP21 United Nations Conference on Climate Change. Just 2 years later, he delivered a speech that encouraged sustainable development at the United Nations General Assembly in New York. At 18, Vic became a plaintiff in the most well-known and progressive atmospheric litigation case to date, Juliana v. United States. Through these experiences, Vic has continued to advocate for climate justice by empowering youth, Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples to unite for the betterment of this and future generations. If you have questions for Vic during Vic's lecture, please put them in the public chat below, and I will do my best to get to them in the 15 minutes reserved for questions at the end. With that, I'm honored to welcome Vic Barrett. Vic.
Thank you so much, Brendan. And hey, everyone. I hope you had a good day. I'm really excited to be joining PIELC today. Like Brendan said, my name is Vic Barrett. I'm a climate advocate, and I've been doing this work for about 6 years now. I'm just going to disclaim I'm using two computers, one to present and one to be able to read what I have. So if you see me going back and forth, that's what's happening. But first, I'd like to start off by recognizing the Lenape people of Manhattan. That's where I began my journey as a climate activist, and much of what I can teach you now. I'd like to acknowledge the Kiowa Puya tribes that inhabited the area around Eugene and Springfield, Oregon, and as well as the Anishinaabe tribes that inhabit the areas of the Midwest that I currently live. I was actually lucky enough to go to PIELC. I don't know what you guys call it, actually. I always just say PIELC. In person with a few of my co-plaintiffs a few years ago. And we got to present and be asked questions by a pretty amazing audience. And I have a really deep connection at Eugene. I've gotten to eat a lot of really good food there and have a lot of fun times with my co-plaintiffs. I love Eugene. So I'm going to be telling you guys a little bit about my story and what launched me into this work. I'm going to talk a little bit about my work on the lawsuit, suing the U.S. federal government and its current status. as well as covering the relevance of climate justice concepts and storytelling as tools to support work with the goal of shifting the government or legal work in general. So I'm going to share my screen. Let's do it. Awesome. So a little introduction. Who's this kid? Who am I? That is talking to me. So, like I said, Vic. I'm a first generation Garifuna American. My people are an Afro-Indigenous community, originally from the island of St. Vincent in the Caribbean. In the 18th and 19th centuries, we were pushed from our homeland on St. Vincent by British colonial power, settling on the eastern coast of Central America in Honduras and Belize. So despite overwhelming adversity, we organized our community and emancipated ourselves from colonial rule to protect our future as a people and make sure little Garifuna kids like me could make it here. So that's the story of my ancestors, and obviously it runs through my blood. It influences a lot of what I do, but I physically grew up in a 98% white conservative community in rural upstate New York. So I've always been pretty deeply aware of what fairness feels like and what injustice feels like. A lot of my lived experience growing up, even the little moments of being treated differently because I was different, always felt really devastating. And that's totally guided the way that I move through the world. I've always been really disturbed by instances of unfairness or injustice, almost to a fault sometimes. I'm sure it makes me pretty annoying most of the time. But moving on to getting educated. Oops. Great. So for high school, my mom and I moved closer to New York City, and I ended up going to high school in the West Village, which was starkly different than rural upstate New York. The West Village is where the Stonewall riots happened. I went to school a few blocks from Christopher Street. Just not the same as upstate New York. And I finally just had a chance to engage with people who are more like me and felt the same way that I do about the world. I joined this nonprofit called Global Kids, which was an org with the mission of teaching young students, predominantly students of color, predominantly Black students from at-risk communities, about what it meant to be a global citizen. And I remember I just joined that because I wanted to get into a mix, get into something different than what I was experiencing upstate. I remember for our first meeting of the Human Rights Activist Project, the program that I had decided to join, which is when a bunch of young people got to come together and build their own campaign. They told us the issues that we would be building a campaign around was going to be climate change. And I remember at first, I was very much like, am I in the right place? But very, very quickly, I started to realize the intersections between race and climate change, and really quickly learned about climate justice as a concept. I learned about how most low income and public housing in New York City is built on the front lines of climate change, and how Black and brown people were put on the front lines of Hurricane Sandy, basically as if we were just a shield for the wealthy people that live in New York. I learned that in the South Bronx, an area occupied predominantly by Black and brown people, asthma rates are some of the highest in the country. There's children that literally can't go, like can't breathe. And I was learning all of these things around the same time. I was going home to news reports on Michael Brown's shooting, and I was watching the movement for Black Lives kicking off. So I was seeing this extraordinary and visceral violence of police murdering unarmed Black people. And I saw it standing in parallel to the violence I saw in our institutions. And I thought, how are these systems of power going to turn the planet that Black and brown and Indigenous people have stewarded for so long against us and put us on the front lines of an issue that we socioeconomically have been less capable of even creating when it comes to climate change. We aren't the biggest consumers, but tend to be at the front lines of the issue. And I just couldn't sit idly by while learning all of these things at 14, 15 years old, and realizing that everything that I am, which is Black and brown and Indigenous, is being attacked from a lot of sides. If you want to learn more about some of the organizations that I was mentioning that I worked with when I was in high school in New York, you could check these out. Actually, I was a fellow with the Alliance for Climate Education in high school, and currently now I work full time for them as a democracy organizer in Wisconsin, where I now live, doing work to engage young voters of color in the election. Well, was doing work to engage young voters of color in the election, but summer and fall, just engaging young people in key swing states. So moving on to getting activated, seeing the government joining the lawsuit. The relevant topic for this environmental law conference. I started working, so I'll give you the lowdown. I started working in New York City with my friends in these groups like Global Kids and the Alliance for Climate Education to try to mandate climate education in New York City public schools K through 12. We were finding that we wanted to engage other young people on working on climate issues, but also other young people weren't even learning about it in school. So that was one of the first steps that we decided to take. After getting to work on that campaign in New York City, I realized that political leaders are not quick to listen to people who cannot elect them. So we bought policy points and ideas, and they kind of were just giving us pats on the head and photo ops and then kicking us out. And after years of just being like absolutely disillusioned with being a young person trying to make legislative change, I got the amazing opportunity to join the lawsuit. I became a plaintiff on Juliana versus the United States, and basically was getting this opportunity that I felt like I really didn't have in high school to put the cold hard facts of the climate crisis in front of the people who need to be most accountable to it. In front of the federal government, a government responsible for a quarter of global historic carbon emissions on the globe. So with 20 other young people from across the United States, we decided to sue the US federal government for the direct action that it's taken to cause the climate crisis. So basically, our original argument is that they've violated young people's constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property. And they've known since the 1960s that a fossil fuel energy system could have catastrophic climate impacts and still decide to prioritize profit over posterity. Something we talk a lot about in our case, and especially in the beginning, was this distinction between government inaction and government action. And the fact that the government was taking actionable steps to put our future at risk. And it wasn't just about them being negligent, but about the fact that they actively knew everything that they were doing was perpetuating a climate crisis and still decided to do that. So basically, after years of feeling patronized by the system, I got to do exactly what I wanted to do, which was put the information that I knew in front of the people that can make the choices that would impact my future. So we have over 20 experts, and we have 21 stories or 21 plaintiffs that prove that the climate crisis is real. I decided to put a few of my co-plaintiffs in here. So we have Nathan in the corner here who lives in Alaska. Nathan has been facing the direct climate impacts of that happen in Alaska. His family has been in Alaska for like 5 generations or 4 generations, I think it is. Hunting, fishing, all those things that are important to them are at risk because of the climate crisis. We have Jaden, who was living in Louisiana, in Rain, Louisiana, for a lot of when we filed the case, and was actually really heavily impacted by the flooding that happened in Baton Rouge and the surrounding areas a couple of years ago. She woke up one day and stepped into just feet of water, and lives in an area that's losing like inconceivable amounts of land to sea level rise every year in the United States. Then we have Levi, who is our youngest plaintiff on the case. He is 13 now. Well, yeah, he's 13 now. He joined the case when he was 8. He's been on we always joke around like he's been on this case for a third of his life now. Yeah. So it's definitely interesting, to really think about kind of us being kids and doing this lawsuit. He lives on an island off the coast of Florida that is super susceptible to storms. Ever since he was a young kid, has had to experience his neighbors putting sandbags up and helping with that and just preparing for natural disaster. And that's where he grew up and that's where he lives. And it's a place that, might not exist in his lifetime. And then we have Shuta Scott, who is from Boulder, Colorado. He's one of my best friends on the lawsuit. And he's been dealing with some of the climate impacts in Colorado, and also, like me, has been a huge advocate for talking about why we're a part of this case and what it means to us. So the remedy that we are seeking in the case, basically, we have courts denying climate change. And in the courts, when you deny climate change, that's not just rhetoric. We have our defendants in court denying climate change. And the courts, that's not just rhetoric, that's perjury. So that puts us in a good spot. And part of my complaint in the lawsuit highlights that the emissions of the country that my family found a shelter, the United States, is actively drowning the culture that my family comes from in Honduras, a culture that's already labeled critically endangered by UNESCO. And also part of my complaint is that the mental health burden of climate change is incredibly crippling on a young person. And that's something that a lot of other plaintiffs on the lawsuit have in their complaints as well. One of our experts is Lisa Van Struisen, who is a psychologist who talked to us about climate anxiety and just the psychological effects that something like climate change and catastrophic effects on the world have on people who are trying to develop in the world. And so what do we want the government to do about these complaints and how do we want them to answer that? Basically, what we're demanding is that the national government institute a science-based plan to reduce carbon dioxide to 350 parts per million. This is a number that's deemed sustainable by all credible scientists and the number necessary to stop the massive destruction of communities, cultures, and generations that haven't even been born yet. Where we're at now with the lawsuit today, we have a few things going on. We have a congressional resolution that we're introducing. We've been building support among members of Congress to, We've been building support among members of Congress to introduce a resolution that would affirm our right to a stable climate, as well as asking for certain goals around fossil fuel development and carbon emissions to be met. We just recently launched this resolution after me and my plaintiffs got a chance to meet a bunch of government leaders last fall in order to tell them about our work and our stories. Congressman Bobby Rush is one of the lead sponsors, which to me is really exciting because of his history in the fight for Black liberation. 32 members of Congress from 16 different states and 40 organizations have signed on to the resolution, including the American Academy of Pediatrics, the League of Conservation Voters, Sierra Club, Sunrise Movement, Zero Hour. So a really diverse amount of people supporting us on that. And in terms of pending decisions, we're currently in the process of waiting to see if the Ninth Circuit Court makes a revised decision after having a divided panel in our last decision, but ultimately deciding that the federal judiciary couldn't do anything to dictate that the U.S. federal government actions. Here's a quote from Julia Olson, who is our chief legal counsel on the case. I'm just going to read to provide some context on where we're at. The Juliana case is far from over. These plaintiffs will be asking the full court of the Ninth Circuit to review this decision and its catastrophic implications for our constitutional democracy. The court recognized that climate change is exponentially increasing and that the federal government has long known that its actions substantially contribute to the climate crisis. Yet two of the judges on the panel refused to set the standard for redressing the constitutional violation, to protect our nation's children. The standard is a question of science that should be determined at trial. The majority opinion ignores the fact that we have yet to go to trial on the issue of redressability. So as a quote from Julia Olson, the executive director of our Children's Trust and chief legal counsel on the case. So, and obviously with COVID coming up, the courts are moving a little bit more slowly than usual, but we are waiting to hear back from the Ninth Circuit Court, and our lawyers have been pretty persistent and pretty active in communicating with them. Any updates, anything that will be relevant to them in making their decision, and that's something that I always really appreciate about our lawyers. I am 21 years old. I've been on this case for a few years. I'm not a legal expert by any means. This case maybe made me a bit more of a legal expert, but like not even close to however long you need to go to school in order to become a lawyer. So I always really appreciative of the work that our lawyers do to kind of explain to us what's going on, explain to us what's relevant to us, making sure we have full context of what our government is saying in response to our argument. And then obviously with the election coming up, we started this lawsuit against the Obama administration, actually. It's continued through the Trump administration. As we move into the Biden administration, there are different routes and a lot of different opportunities to take in terms of what can change with the case. Seeing who's going to be even coming in that's new, who's going to be in the Department of Justice that's different. What are the conversations that are going to be had? All things that obviously are being taken into consideration by people who went to school for much longer than I have. All right, and then we're doing really good on time, actually. Okay, sorry, looking at what I have next. All right, and then storytelling. So this portion, actually, I'm going to preface with a video that I'm going to share for you. And kind of just with the example of, I'm going to go a little bit into talking about climate justice a little more, talking about storytelling more, and talking about how those are tools that are integral to supplementing legal work and supplementing work that is in systems that maybe you wouldn't always think have a bunch of room for maybe leaning into the movement and creativity and all of these things. There's always that these work together, and so I'm gonna go a little bit into that next. So I'll preface it with this video. 5 minutes long. I think I put my screen sharing, so it should work well. So let's see. Looking at the numbers coming in, oh God, Australia had 300,000 people. Apparently Germany had 1.4 mil on its own. So this crowd might be actually huge.
Vic Barrett is a 20-year-old climate activist from White Plains, New York. Please welcome Vic to the stage.
Starting on this day, September 20th, 2019, everything began to change.
My mother left the coast of Honduras, a place battered by storms and sea level rise, to find opportunity in New York City, the city of immigrants. I wonder how many people trying to find refuge here knew that because of the amount of money in their bank account or the color of their skin, they'd be placed on the front lines of disasters like Hurricane Sandy. Sandy, Maria, Irma, Dorian. This crisis follows people. My name is Vic Barrett. I'm 20 years old, and I'm one of the 21 youth plaintiffs in the Juliana versus United States constitutional lawsuit, suing the executive branch of the federal government for knowingly causing climate change, irreversibly threatening our health, our personal security, our homes, and our communities by recreating a dangerous climate system. Like youth who have come before us in the civil rights movement and other social justice movements, it is often the youth that must shine a light on systems of injustice. We know the world we want to grow up in better than anybody else does. And so we need to be listened to.
I was born into a world in which my future is being stolen from me. Born into a world where my people face extinction. Indigenous lands all over our planet are being flooded, poisoned, and destroyed. My black brothers and sisters are being gunned down by police. Migrant children are dying at the border. Trans folks are being murdered. Violence is in the air that we breathe.
There is a lesson I have learned from my ancestors. Some of us are blessed with the ability to withstand the unthinkable in our blood. My people were stripped of their humanity, were made a product, but they fought back, risking it all so that I can exist. I exist at the intersection of the identities I inhabit. First gen, trans, Indigenous, Latino, Black. It took 20 years for me to realize that I had developed mechanisms for resilience that I didn't even know I had. I will never simply hand over what centuries of struggle made mine, and I'm not alone. We must do whatever it takes, whatever it takes.
Do y'all make some noise?
Definitely high energy in this park right now. There are so many people here, I couldn't even tell you how much. Out here to strike and get their voices heard and make sure that we're marching to Battery Park and letting the politicians and the political leaders who are about to be here for the UN Summit know that young people care about this issue.
We're here to write a new story. A story in which our country is doing everything in its power to address not only the climate crisis, but the systemic injustices at its roots. Those history books won't write themselves. So I want you to repeat after me. This is our future. This is our future. And I will do whatever it takes to protect our rights, to protect our planet, and to protect our people. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So to me, climate justice is the root of why I do this work. It's the root of my story. Considering the identities that I hold, I think that the social justice implications of this crisis are enormous. And there's a lot of people who are living at the margins of society. Women are often responsible for gathering and producing food, collecting water, sourcing fuel, for heating and cooking globally. With climate change, these tasks are more difficult. Extreme weather events such as droughts and floods have a greater impact on the poor and most vulnerable. 70% of the world's poor are women. There are 400 million indigenous people worldwide, protecting 80% of biodiversity on Earth, yet they're giving the smallest portions of fundings for mitigating a climate crisis that they didn't exist, but that impacts them more than we can even imagine. Migrants are fleeing a crisis they didn't create to try and survive in countries like ours. Climate change has decimated so much agricultural opportunity in regions already destabilized by political choices that are a lot of times something the US had its hand in. And these are just scratching the surface. It's incredibly important to me that stories of young people that look like me are included in the narrative of why this climate crisis is truly a crisis and is truly a humanitarian crisis at its root. And that can look like giving a speech to the UN General Assembly and playing that inside game when I was 17, or interrupting U.S. fossil fuel panels at the UN climate conference to uplift frontline voices when I was 19. I've engaged at the international level and the national level and the local level, always to varying comfortabilities. But I've always felt it's integral that I put myself in these spaces. When I was younger, I found that so often I was the only person who looked like me in different spaces. But now that I'm older, fortunately, that's not always the case. And it's really indicative of how the movement's shifting. It's definitely not always comfortable to be the young Black, Latino, Indigenous, trans person in the United Nations or at the World Economic Forum. But I've found that I have the power to change the conversation that's going on. One story I sometimes think of is when I spoke at the UN General Assembly. I remember having to fill out an invitation, and the invitation asks you if you're a head of state, a crowned prince or princess, or like, I don't know, there's not options that are like, I'm a regular person and a teenager. I remember being scared and nervous and like about to go and give my speech, and Forrest Whitaker spoke before me, and everyone in the audience looked pretty bored. Honestly, no one was paying attention at all. You could tell they sit in those meetings all the time. They sit in the General Assembly and they listen to what people say and they take notes, and then they still listen to their own bottom line. That's what happens. But I remember being terrified, and I also remember stepping up to the podium, and the first thing I said is, "Hi, I'm Vic Barrett. I'm 17 years old. I go to high school a few blocks from here." And you could see people start to look up and start to pay attention, because it's like, you know, who's this kid? Who lets this kid in here? And I think that's a kind of significant story, because, you know, oftentimes the people who feel most powerless have this, when we get in the positions we need to, have this really unique ability to make people pay attention. If we want solutions to this crisis, we need to turn to the communities that have been protecting themselves from abusive systems for decades. Like that's what that's what they do, right? And I believe most of the resilience and ability to combat this issue exists in communities that have always had to work around gross power structures in order to survive and even thrive. I was born existing at a lot of intersections and existing as a person who would always need protection from those in power, and I'm not alone. And that's the case for a lot of people who don't fit the mold of what society upholds. People who are of color, people who identify as women, people who are queer, people who are poor. The list goes on. In today's world, we uphold resilience as a tactic that we need to survive, but we ignore a lot of the people who've been doing it since day one. And the people on the front lines of the issues that are most prevalent in our society have been born with the most integral skills for fighting against that. And it's a responsibility of those of us with privilege and who recognize the issues we see around us and have the capability to dissect them and dissect gatekeeping like language and things like that, to respect all of the inherent strength that already exists within marginalized communities, and provide platforms for that strength to be shared and highlighted. Young people, I think, understand what I'm saying more than anyone. Young people want to do what makes sense, not just for their bottom line, but for broader culture. We just care about each other in a lot of ways. And I think more people are realizing that we absolutely cannot fix the issue of climate change while ignoring things like trans rights or migrant rights or indigenous rights. We can't talk about it without erasing mental health stigma and without erasing ageism. And I'm really fortunate to be a part of the generation that I am, because I feel like we've brought a lot of these conversations on intersectionality and recognizing who we are to like, I think the last point that I have actually, which will, I think, will leave us a little extra time for questions, but being a plaintiff on this case was never and is never going to be just about what's written in our complaints. It's about what we've experienced, we've seen in our lives. Legal cases are bolstered not just by codes and laws and books and lots of books. I know you guys read so many books, but also by the movement behind the change that's being pushed for. I've gotten to be a lot of space with a lot of different people asking for the for the change that my generation craves. I would just challenge everyone in this room or everyone listening to this lecture to take a moment to really intentionally consider that law and legal action can be what supplements and can really tangibly be what supplements a diverse, creative, complex thing like radical change. And they can work hand in hand. And I think a lot of times in my activist journey, I've had to be like, oh, I'm doing my inside game, or I'm suing the U.S. government, but also like I think everything about the U.S. government at the end of the day doesn't really work, right? But it's about being willing to see that the change that you don't think is the most radical is also what we need to make the radical change happen. And that's something that I've learned on my journey as being a plaintiff on this lawsuit. And I think that's the challenge that I'd leave for everyone. Just think about how things that we don't think of as diverse, creative, complex, or radical, like law and legal action can be and can bolster the radical movement we need to see the change that a lot of people like me are asking for. So yeah, I think that's all I have. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Vic. That was incredible. I do have a few questions canned for you, and then there were a few interesting thoughts that came through the chat as well while you were speaking. So
Awesome.
hoping to get your insights on those. So the first one, which you've touched on a couple times, but I guess it's worth reiterating, is how did you first become involved in the Juliana case? How did you hear about it? And why did you believe that becoming involved was the best way to fight for environmental and human rights?
Yeah. So I first became involved in the case in 2015. I think it was the summer before my sophomore year of high school. And I remember just having a conversation with somebody from Our Children's Trust, kind of talking about the ways that they go about creating change, and that's through the legal system. And also knowing that there was a bunch of other youth activists involved, some of which I had known or I'd met before in this lawsuit. I remember just being introduced to somebody from Our Children's Trust from Alliance of Climate for Climate Education, the organization that I was working with in New York, and who had partnered with Our Children's Trust on some other things in the past. And I remember just being really excited because, like I said, I did have a lot of frustration with kind of being 16, 15, and having to talk to people that knew I couldn't vote for them and to put them in office, and having to convince them that like the things I cared about were important. And I think I was having a lot of thoughts about youth autonomy and like what is it that young people can do to build our future when one day we have to be handed, the future as the present and like carry it on. And the case just seemed as like this really awesome opportunity to lean into the autonomy that young people can have in deciding our future.
Great, thank you. The next one kind of gets at how you were empowered as a youth to take on such a big issue like this and advance such important ideals. So the question is, do you have an adult, or did you have an adult, guardian, or other figure in your life that empowered or encouraged your advocacy as an adolescent and even today?
Yeah, when I was younger, I think that my mom definitely made me feel empowered to like be an advocate or to speak up, and not in like a really intense or even intentional way. I think just watching her and the things that she decides to care about, and like seeing, even though she was single mom, an immigrant, working a job and having to take care of me, was still able to take time out of her day to care about her people and care about her community and try to do the best for them. I think it's kind of what taught me that caring is inherent, and even though you don't have to get anything back for it necessarily, it benefits you too when you decide to to be intentional and trying to preserve your community or take care of it. And maybe for her, that was more like local work and working with our Garifuna community and the Honduran American community. And I think to me, the way that I thought about it, or with the things that I was learning about climate change, I saw kind of my community as being the world, and not just the world, but particularly the people that are positioned in the world the way that I felt like I've been, or on the margins of society.
Great. So I just had a question that just came in that kind of piggybacks off that idea, and it seems that the root to many of these interrelated problems, gender bias, transgender rights, environmental injustices, etc., is a massive lack of empathy, or maybe a lack of education in a large part of the population. How do you believe that we should teach or build this empathy moving forward?
Yeah, I love that question. I totally agree with that. I talk about kind of the lack of, or at least to me, like what I've always seen is kind of just this strong lack of empathy or being able to understand one another. Because to me, I've always thought if everyone could really understand the way that some people are suffering, why wouldn't everyone do something about it? And I've had to learn over time that it is just like, some people can't put each other in other shoes. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance and psychosis that goes into our culture on the day-to-day, and like dismantling that seems so big sometimes. But to me, what I've found, or what I leaned into as a tool of kind of trying to build that, has always been storytelling, and trying to encourage other people to tell their stories as often and as frequently as possible. Because I think sometimes, people can hear things like environmental justice and people of color are more disproportionately impacted by climate change. And they could hear that and they could think they care about it, but also they could turn it off. But, if you lean into one story, if you hear one story about that one kid, you could think back and be like, oh yeah, like that person's story really impacted me. And like, I could put it into perspective that that's not the only person facing those issues, and I can magnify it. I think that when we create like really intentional content in media and moments for people to share their lived experience, that's when we build more empathy.
And this also kind of goes with another question that just came in, which is, what is your advice for people that are used to being silent, that are generally marginalized but used to being silent? Is it that they need to be put into a space where they have a voice more often, or how do you see those people finding a voice?
Yeah, I like that question because I think in my personal life and the way that I move on the day-to-day, like through the world, like I'm not a very vocal or outspoken person by any means. I'm definitely like an observer. I think that's kind of like the position that I like to take, and sometimes I talk about the things I observe, but because over time that's sort of become my job. but yeah, I think that's a really great question. I feel like everyone has their space in the movement and everyone has their journey and where they end up. And I don't think that every person on the margins or every person that, has been like their whole lives put in a position where it's better to be quiet has to all of a sudden, find this energy to speak up and to be the most outspoken person. Like a lot of the times that's not even safe in a lot of situations. But I think that finding where you can be, what can be an outlet, even if that's not like grabbing a megaphone or hopping onto every Zoom webinar or anything like that, it can also just be, what do you like to do? Do you like to draw? Do you like to make music? Even if you like to play video games, I'm sure there's a way that you can figure out how to do that and also consistently be raising awareness. I think it's just about intentionality. It doesn't have to be about necessarily like the action that you're taking has to be the biggest and the loudest. It has to be the intentions that you put behind it. Kind of going back to that empathy question, I feel like what we provide to culture actually matters. What we provide to like the energy of our society actually matters, and it doesn't have to be being the loudest or biggest person in the room. It starts with you. And so like leaning into yourself, learning more about yourself, I hope that makes sense. Sort of just like, you don't have to be outspoken or loud or anything like that. You just have to contribute to something better, and that doesn't have to look like, doing what I'm doing right now. But
Yeah, so this question kind of flows from that, and it relates to the influence of social media. So how can you speak a little, or can you speak a little to the importance of social media and media in general as a platform to advance climate justice, environmental justice, and human rights? And maybe also talk about how you use social media to advance those initiatives.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, I know that, especially in the active, like this world, when it comes to change making and stuff, there's endless conversations to be had about the position that social media takes into that, if it's positive, if it's negative. There's so much nuance. I think that, to me, though, what I've mostly seen, and like kind of like I said before, is I'm willing to make myself uncomfortable as long as it's building a broader level of understanding. And I think it's sort of the same thing with social media. Like, I'm willing to risk that, maybe not everyone is using it appropriately all the time, and that it's not the best thing for us, to also recognize that it's connected us in the ways that I feel like are necessary in order to build that empathy and everything that we were talking about. I think it's a great tool for storytelling. It's a great tool for education. Something that I've been really excited to see taking off on Instagram, for example, is infographics. I'm taking time off of school right now, but I was studying environmental studies for about 2 years. And there's things that I learned in lectures that recently I've been seeing people just put on infographics and sharing on their story. Things about, why maybe John Muir wasn't the greatest dude ever, and things about why, white colonialism feeds into conservation, and all of these things that I learned in a classroom, on my Instagram, just for people to swipe through. And I think that's amazing. I think it's cool, the bigger level of understanding that we're creating. I think also it could go in other ways too, where sometimes I feel like it could give this illusion that people need to be in every now this video and have tens of thousands of followers in order to be like an activist and to be doing something. And I think also, it's about approaching with the understanding that it's an illusion too. You have to be able to. I think it's about consuming it. You have to be able to consume it responsibly. People have to be able to use it responsibly. There's a lot that has to go into play for it to be the perfect tool. But I think that it is a great tool for change making and for the movement.
Great. So I have another one for you. We're kind of shifting away from empathy and the use of social media. And I know that you touched on surviving different natural disasters on the East Coast, including multiple hurricanes and Superstorm Sandy. Here in Oregon, over the beginning in early August and through September, we were going through some severe wildfires here that ended up moving into towns and destroying homes and affecting my family and many other families here. So my question is, how have you been able to reconcile the time needed to recover with advancing climate change advocacy after a natural disaster? How do you, because a lot of people that are healing from natural disasters don't necessarily want to jump to conclusions. They want time to heal.
Yeah, most definitely. I would say to that, if anything, that process of recovery is one of the most important things that we need people to be able to do, and most important, it's part of the work. That recovery, it's coming to terms with a changing world, and the fact that it's not going to be the last time that people have to cope with a natural disaster and come together as a community. I feel like what to me, when I think of recovery, I think of all the mutual aid that I have a lot of friends that live in Oregon, so much of the mutual aid that I saw popping up on my Facebook page, and so many of the places where you can go and find resources to recovery. I think that that is really the movement, and that is progressing climate change advocacy. Kind of the moments that community can come together and support itself through that recovery process is one of the most important organic things that can happen in our movement and when it comes to climate change work, I feel like, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I understand where you're going with that one. Thank you. So I have two more for you.
Okay.
And the I guess I'll start with one that has a little bit more of a legal touch on it, and then I'll end with encouraging those that are watching to get involved. So as we've seen with the appointment of numerous federal judges by the Trump administration and now Amy Coney Barrett, how do you see or what difficulties do you see arising as if or when this case moves beyond the Ninth Circuit?
Yeah, yeah. I think that this is something our lawyers have talked to us about for sure. Kind of just what the Supreme Court looks like right now, what it could look like going to the Supreme Court. I think I have a lot of confidence in, and this isn't me saying that I expect everyone to do the unthinkable, but I have confidence in at least our argument and its rootedness in the Constitution, and what I feel like are the facts that even maybe somebody who's not like, a 21-year-old leftist climate activist like me can get on board with, when you actually get into the nitty-gritty of it all and looking at what the Constitution is and interpreting the Constitution, which is what, I'm pretty sure they're supposed to do. I feel as though even though in what looks like a really bleak situation, the little part of me that does want to have some faith in the way that the system is supposed to work hopes that, because if it does work the way that it's supposed to, that it can see the credence in our constitutional argument, if that checks out. I know there's lawyers watching, so maybe it doesn't, but I think it does.
I know what you're getting to. Thank you. Okay, and then the last one is kind of putting together a canned question I had, and then one that came through from one of the viewers, and it's for those interested in climate advocacy, which grassroots organizations and or initiatives do you suggest they become involved with? I know you touched on a few in the beginning there, but if you could touch on them again and maybe just give a little plug.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like, when it comes to grassroots organizations too, I'll drop a few, but kind of it's all about it's all about flexibility too, because you're going to go to one of the orgs I mentioned meetings, and then you're going to meet a bunch of cool people there too that maybe have their own org and are doing their own thing. So none of this is really stringent, but I think a good place to start out is checking out your local sunrise hubs, because there's probably a bunch of cool young people that care about the climate right there. Start those conversations. Checking out Extinction Rebellion hubs. So Sunrise, Extinction Rebellion, Earth Guardians has chapters in a lot of cities all over the U.S. and I know 0 Hour has chapters as well. So those 4 organizations I just mentioned, Sunrise, Extinction Rebellion, Earth Guardian, 0 Hour. Right now, you can go to any of their websites, probably find a local hub, and I think that's a great first place to start. I was going to say, you could have fun at your first meeting and hang out together, but the way things are looking, it might be on Zoom, which is great too. So I think those are a great places to start, just meeting people at least.
Great. Thank you, Vic.
Yeah.
I'm going to echo a lot of what's coming through in the chat right now and express my greatest thanks for you jumping on tonight. And I'm glad we got everything worked out, and we're rooting for you as you continue through your advocacy. So with
Yeah,
that,
thanks so much, Brendan. Yeah,
yeah.
you're awesome too.
Thanks. With that, I'm going to share my screen and hopefully we'll stay in contact. Thank you, everyone.
Most definitely.